Hello, it's nice to see you again. Today, following our last session on disability support payments, I will talk about registering for the CLBC service, which you can receive once you turn 19. First, CLBC stands for Community Living BC. To give you a bit of background, until the 1970s in British Columbia, Canada, people with developmental disabilities were sent to institutions. But starting in the late 1970s, a deinstitutionalization movement began, led mainly by parents. From then on, facilities started to close, and by the mid-1990s, the last institution shut its doors. From that point, people with developmental disabilities began to move into the community. At that time, an organization called MCFTD began providing support for people with developmental disabilities. Then, in 2005, a separate department dedicated solely to supporting adults with developmental disabilities branched off from MCFTD and started as a quasi-governmental agency called CLBC. As of 2023, according to the data I found, there are about 27,000 adults with developmental disabilities receiving services from CLBC. Each year, around 1,000 new individuals with developmental disabilities register for CLBC services. So first, I will talk about the eligibility requirements. As I mentioned earlier, you must be 19 years old to receive CLBC services. However, you can apply for registration starting at age 16. This is related to PWD, which we talked about last time. You become eligible for PWD benefits start at age 18. But when I explained the PWD application process, I mentioned that there is a standard process and a simplified process. To be eligible for the simplified process, you need to be receiving MCFD services or be registered for CLBC services. So, since you can apply for CLBC services from the age of 16, if you register for the service in advance when you apply for PWD at 17.5 years old, there is a much higher chance that you can go through the simplified process. So, since the application process becomes simpler, please make sure to start registering for CLBC services as soon as you turn 16. If you are currently receiving MCFD services, please contact your MCFD facilitator and let them know that you would like to register for CLBC. If you are not registered with MCFD but are a person with a developmental disability who wishes to receive CLBC services, please apply directly for CLBC services. There are two categories for applying for CLBC services. One is the developmental disabilities category, often referred to as DD. The other is which stands for Personalized Support Initiative, a somewhat complex term. So there are these two categories. To put it simply, DD refers to individuals with developmental disabilities who need more support, while PSI refers to those with developmental disabilities who require relatively less support. As briefly shown below in English, DD refers to cases where there is a significant intellectual disability. Next, there must be documentation showing that the disability began before the age of 18. Also for PSI, since we are mainly talking about people with autism, a diagnosis of autism is required. In addition, it must be proven that there are significant difficulties in adaptive functioning. Now, I will explain the application process. As I mentioned earlier, if your child under the age of 18 is already receiving services from MCFT, you should contact the MCFT facilitator and let them know that you want to transfer to CLBC. You can apply for this starting at age 16, so please contact MCFT when you turn 16. If that's not the case, you can still apply once you turn 16, so even if you are not registered with MCFT services, you can apply to CLBC. I've written the phone number here, 1-877-660-2522, and sometimes people ask if they can apply for CLBC services before moving to BC from another province. It is possible, so while you are still in another province, you can contact CLBC services and proceed with the necessary steps. Once you make contact, the first thing CLBC does is assign a facilitator. To put it simply, a facilitator refers to the person in charge of the individual with a disability. who will guide you through the various procedures and required documents. To explain the third part, which is document submission, you basically need an assessment report. Of course, the assessment report must be prepared by a professional. Next, there is a form from CLBC. On that form, in the case of DD, it must clearly state the diagnostic criteria for intellectual disability. Of course, CLBC can confirm these details by looking at the assessment report. Next, as mentioned earlier, in the case of PSI, it should state the diagnosis of ASD. ASD refers to autism. Some people often get confused about whether it's DD or PSI. And there are also those who ask, if DD doesn't apply, how can I qualify under PSI? Usually, if you ask the professional who conducts the assessment, they will know. So, after the assessment, they will tell you things like, it seems your child does not fall under the PSI category, or your child can be included in the PSI category. But this assessment is done both when the child is young and again when they become an adult. As they get older, the gap with their peer group tends to widen. So even if your child makes some developmental progress, the gap may actually become larger. Therefore, if a previous assessment report indicated that your child was functioning too well to qualify for PSI, I recommend having the assessment done again. So even if your child was not eligible in the past because their functioning was too good, as they get older, their condition may worsen compared to their peers, making them eligible. I strongly recommend that you consult with a professional and thoroughly check whether your child qualifies for DD or PSI before submitting any applications. Now, once you have submitted all these documents, a facilitator or eligibility facilitator from CLBC will review all the documents and inform you whether your child qualifies for CLBC services. Now, if you have received confirmation that you meet the eligibility requirements, the next step would be to find out what kinds of services are available. To help with this, CLBC regularly holds something called a welcome workshop. If you ask a CLBC facilitator or your CLBC representative, they will probably let you know when the workshop is being held and advise you to attend. By gathering this information, you can determine which services your child needs and then request those services from CLBC. There is a navigation service provided by MCFT, or it's called the Navigator Service, and the agency name is STAD. This is a type of consulting service for youth aged 16 to 24 who are preparing for adulthood. This service explains in detail how to complete the necessary procedures and documents. Once you understand all of this, you need to apply for the services. To give you the four main categories, the first is a service called Community Inclusion. Community inclusion, as the name suggests, refers to services like day programs or various activities carried out in the local community during the day. Residential services are for situations where a child can no longer be cared for by their parents at home, or even if they could, sometimes the child is sent to another household for the sake of their independence. All these various services are referred to as residential support. Next, there are employment services that help with your child's employment. And there are respite services which provide funding so that parents who often find it very challenging to support their child can have some time off. For now, that's all for today's explanation. I will see you next time. Thank you.